Poems to a Listener, readings and conversation with contemporary poets.
People here used to believe that drowned souls lived in the seals. At spring tides they might change shape. They loved music and swam in for a singer, who might stand at the end of summer in the mouth of a whitewashed turf shed, his shoulder to the jam, his song a rowboat far out in evening. When I came here first, you were always singing, a hint of the clip of the pick in your winnowing climb and attack. Raise it again, man. We still believe what we hear.
Welcome to Poems to a Listener. I'm Henry Lyman, and in this half-hour program, and next week also, we'll be talking with Irish poet Seamus Heaney, and listening to him read from his poems 1965 to 1975, and from Fieldwork, both published by Farrar Straus Giroux. The passage we just heard, from a poem called The Singer's House, is set on the northwestern coast of the Irish Republic. It addresses a singer, and it is in a way a call for music and poetry to raise their song freely in the face of whatever trouble.
One summer night, we were all congregated in Donegal, in the west of Ireland, on a kind of rocky, sea-glittering coast. The kind of dream life of the country happens, in a sense, over there. And we sat up all night, more or less, singing and drinking. And it seemed to me that this was a moment of retrieval. In a sense, I had come through a period in my life when I felt like, to hell with mourning on behalf of the condition that we're in. Let's add to the sum of freedom by
Singing?
By singing, yeah.
And what about the seal singers?
Well, that's an old folk belief that if you played music to the seals or sang, that they would come close.
So we're the seals, in a sense, listening, being called in by the poem.
Well, I mean, it's not for me to say that. The Peninsula. When you have nothing more to say, just drive for a day all round the peninsula. The sky is tall as over a runway, the land without marks, so you will not arrive but pass through, though always skirting landfall. At dusk, horizons drink down sea and hill, the ploughed field swallows the whitewashed gable, and you're in the dark again. Now recall the glazed foreshore and silhouetted log, that rock where breakers shredded into rags, the leggy birds stilted on their own legs, islands riding themselves out into the fog, and drive back home, still with nothing to say, except that now you will uncode all landscapes by this: things founded clean on their own shapes, water and ground in their extremity.
So this is a place you used to drive sometimes when you needed something, something to say, something to hear?
That's exactly it, yes. It's a different landscape from the western landscape. It's the rather calm farmland atmosphere of the Ards Peninsula and County Down. And there was something very pacifying and clean and Presbyterian almost in the landscape. It kind of rinsed you. It didn't offer any rewards other than the reward of some sense of entering a realm of purity.
And just being there, just being
there,
itself.
exactly. But it's the opposite in some ways to something in myself too, which is muddier and grassy.
Yeah. The bog side.
The bog, yeah.
There's another landscape behind many of your poems, it seems to me.
Yeah, halfway between east and west, as it were. I mean, and I'm speaking now of the small landscape of Ulster, which is about 100 miles from one side to the other. It's landlocked on the farm where I grew up, which is very kind of raggle-taggle farmland. with soft, wet corners and small hills and hedges and
some rivers and streams.
Rivers and streams, indeed. My secret places as a youngster tended to be near water, near the river. There was one particular gravel bed on the River Myola, which I still go to, just to stand at it. It's a kind of watering hole for the spirit of some sort, you know. It's the one near which there were these little nests for sand martins. So I wrote this poem called Homecomings, which in a sense is about being drawn back, and in another sense is a metaphor for having a sexual home too. Homecomings. Fetch me the sand martin, skimming and veering, breast to breast with himself, in the clouds in the river. At the worn mouth of the hole, flight after flight after flight, the swoop of his wings gloved and kissed home. A glottal stillness, an eardrum. Far in, feather brains tucked in silence, a silence of water lipping the bank. Mould my shoulders inward to you. Occlude me. Be damp clay pouting. Let me listen under your eaves.
The sand martin flies home, upriver, and into his nest. And in a way, you're almost becoming the sand martin here, aren't you?
Well, for the first 12 years of my life, I was hardly more than 5 or 10 miles away from the farm I grew up on. And when I began to write poetry, of course, the landscape of that first place, the physical landscape and the emotional landscape there, were the places that I inhabited as a writer.
And now, is it still there? I mean, behind your poems?
It still is there, I think, yes. I think for words to have any kind of independent energy for me, in some way they have to be animated by, I don't know how to say this correctly, but there are times you use words and they don't have any viscous weight for you. They're just counters, they're flimsy. And until they can get connected up with some channel towards a first place in yourself, and that channel opens down, and then as it opens down allows energy to come up, until that happens the words don't have that freedom and conviction that you need to write poems.
And does that energy come up then almost as a kind of sound, something that you listen for?
Of course sound is paramount, yeah. I mean, it is the first thing.
The country sounds and the speech of the country?
Well, exactly, yeah. The poet has to find the language that makes the common, almost unconscious life vocal. He must be a voice box for something that is in the land and in the people. I wrote this little poem called Oracle, which was drawn from a moment in childhood when I was lost for a little while. My parents have often told me about this. I was standing in a hollow tree, just standing there for the pleasure of standing in it. And I think of the tree as kind of a throat, and the child in the tree as a little uvula, and the whole thing as a voice box. Oracle. Hide in the hollow trunk of the willow tree, its listening familiar, until, as usual, they cuckoo your name across the fields. You can hear them draw the poles of styles as they approach, calling you out. Small mouth and ear in a woody cleft, lobe and larynx of the mossy places.
Where was the tree?
At the back of the house. I mean, it's gone now. It was cut down.
And this tree is has both lobe and larynx of mossy places, which reminds me of the name of your farm, which was moss bawn, meaning?
Moss was our word for a bog, a Scottish northern word. Bawn is the word, it's an English word for a fortified farm dwelling, technically speaking, what the planters built when they came to Ulster in the 17th century. They built bawns. For me, it's a very kind of harvest-like word. It's kind of ripe and thatched itself. So Moss Bawn was, in a sense, the farmhouse on the bog.
What did your father grow there?
A little bit of everything: potatoes, corn, barley, and grass-seed, hay, so on. It involved horse ploughs and the chatter of mowing machines, and there's a whole kind of communal life also, as well as the kind of the single, solitary dream life of the child. There was that terrific communal labouring life where one family helped another family, and there was all kinds of rhythms there. And there was a kind of banter and mockery in it too. Follower. My father worked with a horse plough. His shoulders globed like a full sail strung between the shafts and the furrow. The horses strained at his clicking tongue. An expert, he would set the wing and fit the bright steel-pointed sock. The sod rolled over without breaking. At the head rig, with a single pluck of reins, the sweating team turned round and back into the land. His eye narrowed and angled at the ground, mapping the furrow exactly. I stumbled in his hobnailed wake, fell sometimes on the polished sod. Sometimes he rode me on his back, dipping and rising to his plod. I wanted to grow up and plough, to close one eye, stiffen my arm. All I ever did was follow in his broad shadow round the farm. I was a nuisance, tripping, falling, yapping always. But today, it is my father who keeps stumbling behind me and will not go away.
Your father's almost like a sailor there, steering the plough, steering the ship at sea.
A terrific sight, that, really, the line of energy and the man ploughing with horses from the horse's head.
And you behind him, following
Yeah, well,
yapping.
that was literally true, that. But of course it is also a cyclic image for following literally the father, and then in your own memory your father following you. The other thing I liked about, I found this out much later on after I wrote the poem, was that the word for a line of verse in Latin, versus, which means the turn, the verse means the turn at the end of the line, it was also used, and it makes sense, for the turn that the ploughman made at the end of the furrow. It was a versus. So this kind of linking of earthwork and wordwork has kind of pleased me.
Right. The poem turns as the plough turns.
That's right. Mm-hmm. There's this other poem, Digging, which is another kind of wordwork poem. It was really the first poem I wrote where I felt I had opened the channel right to whatever source in myself was a supply source. And again, it has to do with the generational thing. It's a poem called Digging. Between my finger and my thumb, the squat pen rests, snug as a gun. Under my window, a clean rasping sound when the spade sinks into gravelly ground. My father digging. I look down till his straining rump among the flower beds bends low, comes up 20 years away, stooping in rhythm through potato drills where he was digging. The coarse boot nestled on the lug. The shaft against the inside knee was levered firmly. He rooted out tall tops, buried the bright edge deep to scatter new potatoes that we picked, loving their cool hardness in our hands. By God, the old man could handle a spade, just like his old man. My grandfather cut more turf in a day than any other man on Toner's bog. Once I carried him milk in a bottle corked sloppily with paper. He straightened up to drink it, then fell to right away, nicking and slicing neatly, heaving sods over his shoulder, going down and down for the good turf. Digging. The cold smell of potato mould, the squelch and slap of soggy peat, the curt cuts of an edge through living roots awaken in my head. But I've no spade to follow men like them. Between my finger and my thumb, the squat pen rests. I'll dig with it.
Your father and your grandfather were both diggers. Your father digging potatoes, your grandfather cutting peat for fuel. And you, with your pen, your instrument. Do you see poetry then, or writing poetry, still as a kind of digging?
Digging and divining. My father also had the ability to divine water. At least he said he had. He persuaded us that he had. And I think of the digging as the kind of technical, almost learnable craft side of writing. The ability to handle the tools, to strike in accurately.
Well, this poem certainly digs the sound right out of the turf, the squelch and slap of soggy peat.
I think writing and poetry has to deal with the roughage in a way. You know, that's one of its responsibilities. If it gets too far away from the roughage of experience, it gets a bit exquisite for my taste.
It's too brittle, perhaps, too sublime.
Too sublime or too brittle. But the divining thing is the other side, and that is poetry isn't just a matter of assembling the elements or crafting the pieces or digging the bits out or digging. It's also a matter of locating some spring, some source of energy and releasing it. And the water diviner actually is the man who, he's not quite a craftsman, he's more a finder of things.
And an artist in a way.
And an artist, yeah. Operating by instinct, by intuition, and that intuition expressing itself in a little moment of excitement when his diviner's rod, his douser's rod, kind of jumps or twists. So I wrote this poem, The Diviner, which is the other side of the thing. Cut from the green hedge a forked hazel stick that he held tight by the arms of the V, circling the terrain, hunting the pluck of water, nervous but professionally unfussed. The pluck came sharp as a sting, the rod jerked down with precise convulsions, spring waters suddenly broadcasting through a green hazel its secret stations. The bystanders would ask to have a try. He handed them the rod without a word. It lay dead in their grasp, till, nonchalantly, he gripped expectant wrists. The hazel stirred.
You saw this?
It was a fascinating thing. I had forgotten that I had seen it. This poem was written in my mid-20s. And I said to myself, my God, did I really see that? Did I really see that? And then, of course, I did. Yes, I did see that. And there was it immediately suggested to me the idea of, as I say, of the diviner as an image for the imaginative pursuit.
The divining rod is itself like the pen. It's also magic.
Exactly. It's a kind of forked stick, just very ordinary and inert until it finds itself at the right moment, in the right place, in the right hands.
The Diviner is a poem, of course, about a kind of magician in a way, but also a craftsman, one who performs a particular service. And you have a number of poems on such people.
I did a poem about a thatcher, for example. That was one of the kind of delights of the innocent childhood eye, was to see a thatcher at work on a roof, an old grey, mouse-coloured thatched roof. and putting on a new roof of straw, of wheat straw. The thing literally became golden, kind of like a honeycomb. So that seemed to me another emblem of what the writer or the artist or the imagination could do, which was to not gild in a bad way the natural world, but to refresh it, to take the tarnish off it, to brighten it up.
And provide a bit of a surprise.
Provide a little bit of a surprise. This is the Thatcher. Notoriously difficult to pin down the Thatchers. They would say they would come in such a week, and then they wouldn't come, and then suddenly there he would be on top of the roof. Bespoke for weeks, he turned up some morning unexpectedly, his bicycle slung with a light ladder and a bag of knives. He eyed the old rigging, poked at the eaves, opened and handled sheaves of lashed wheat straw. Next, the bundled rods. Hazel and willow were flicked for weight, twisted in case they'd snap. It seemed he spent the morning warming up. Then fixed the ladder, laid out well-honed blades, and snipped at straw and sharpened ends of rods that, bent in two, made a white-pronged staple for pinning down his world, handful by handful. Couchant for days on sods above the rafters, he shaved and flushed the butts, stitched all together into a sloped honeycomb, a stubble patch, and left them gaping at his Midas touch.
He's an artist, a Thatcher and an artist. And like a performer, this Thatcher spends the morning warming up.
That's right.
For his productions.
That's right.
And in thatching the roof, he's pinning down his world, handful by handful.
He works very patiently and slowly. There's none of them left, of course, or hardly any of them left. It's all a slated world now, or a tiled world.
But there's still a few craftsmen in the village, or? Well,
I think so. I mean, I think people move from thatching to welding. You know, it's a different kind of material, a different kind of pace, different kind of relationship of the thing you make with the people you make it for, I suppose. The forge. All I know is a door into the dark. Outside, old axles and iron hoops rusting. Inside, the hammered anvil's short-pitched ring, the unpredictable fantail of sparks, or hiss when a new shoe toughens in water. The anvil must be somewhere in the centre, horned as a unicorn, at one end square, set there immovable. An altar where he expends himself in shape and music. Sometimes, leather-aproned, hairs in his nose, he leans out on the jamb, recalls a clatter of hoofs where traffic is flashing in rows. Then grunts and goes in, with a slam and flick to beat rail iron out, to work the bellows.
Where was the forge? Where was the...
Forge was about a mile from where I grew up. I never went into it, but I always stood at the door of it, and it could be heard all over the country with this, the music of the hammer on the anvil.
The music of iron.
It's the music of his work, and this is the thing, that it isn't an effete music, or it isn't sentimental music. It's the music of action, and that's, I think, the most attractive kind of... poetically speaking, artistically speaking, the most attractive kind of music or beauty is that which is the sheen of strength rather than just the desire to charm, you know.
So you do then really see the poet as being a kind of craftsman, a kind of artisan in that sense.
These poems were written at a certain moment, and you know, they are little, like any lyric poem, a flutter of analogy. If they're lucky, they have some kind of
echo,
general truth in them, and But really their function is to make, to be themselves as much as to tell a truth, you know. I used to lie with an ear to the line, for that way, they said, there should come a sound escaping ahead, an iron tune of flange and piston pitched along the ground. But I never heard that. Always, instead, struck couplings and shuntings 2 miles away, lifted over the woods. The head of a horse swirled back from a gate, a grey turnover of haunch and mane, and I'd look up to the cutting where she'd soon appear. 2 fields back, in the house, small ripples shook silently across our drinking water, as they are shaking now across my heart, and vanished into where they seemed to start.
What's the sound you listened for there?
This was the sound of the train coming down the line. I think it's a universal notion that if you put your ear to the railway line, you can hear the train coming, miles away.
And that's the she on the poem.
The she in the poem is indeed the train, which appears when it comes around the corner between the cuttings.
But the sound you listen for is not the sound you hear. You hear these struck shuntings and couplings and bangings and...
Well, exactly.
Which in a way starts the whole movement of the poem. It frightens the horse. It finally ends up in the water.
Yeah.
Creating these ripples. And it creates finally these little ripples across your heart as you remember it, and as you remember the drinking water.
Mm-hmm. Yes, indeed. I don't know, that poem doesn't have the analogy-making intention that something like the Diviner has or whatever. But I tell you what, it records the way in which, in a very, very small and tender event, like the ripple on the surface of water, the way that small tremor can transmit messages of a much bigger power driving along at a distance. And what the poem implies, what I would like it to imply, although this is not in any way an argument in the poem, is that the frail and apparently almost unnoticeable thing, like, to go back to the beginning, the song or the lyric poem, can contain within its little flutter, its little pattern, a register of the big, brutal world beyond it. I think I'll read the poem again.
Good.
I used to lie with an ear to the line, for that way, they said, there should come a sound escaping ahead, an iron tune of flange and piston pitched along the ground. But I never heard that. Always, instead, struck couplings and shuntings 2 miles away, lifted over the woods. The head of a horse swirled back from a gate, a grey turnover of haunch and mane, and I'd look up to the cutting where she'd soon appear. 2 fields back, in the house, small ripples shook silently across our drinking water, as they are shaking now across my heart, and vanished into where they seemed to start.
We've been talking with poet Seamus Heaney, reading from his poems 1965 to 1975, and from Fieldwork, both published by Farrar Straus Giroux. Next week, we'll be speaking again with Seamus Heaney about the so-called Troubles of Ireland, its religious and political divisions and ordeals. I'm Henry Lyman. Thanks for being with us.
Poems to a Listener was produced by WFCR, Amherst, Massachusetts, with technical assistance by Sheldon Katzman. Financial assistance was provided by the Massachusetts Council on the Arts and Humanities, the National Endowment for the Arts, and the Massachusetts Foundation for Humanities and Public Policy.